Greetings! I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build this 1/35th scale Hobby Boss VK4502P Vorne. I'm undoubtedly saying that wrong, but I believe it means that the turret is forward rather than the version you can get with the rear mounted turret. Some of you may recognise this model. I did finish it a while ago, well, the construction part anyway, as part of the prototype vehicles group build on my Discord server. That was a few months ago though. Obviously I'm only just now getting around to editing this rather long video. The box is a bit too big to easily film in the way that I normally do, and there's nothing on the back anyway, so let's just get to looking at what's inside the box. There's a lot of stuff in the box here, including approximately 1 billion individual track links in plastic. Just looking at these sprues, everything seems to be pretty neatly moulded. There is a lot of stuff to look at here, so it can be kind of hard to immediately see flaws, though it's probably a good sign that there aren't any super bad things that jump out right away. A closer look shows that there are indeed some mould lines, and some little bits of flash. Mould lines are kind of inescapable really, and unless they're incredibly bad, I don't see them as a real issue. I go into all builds expecting there to be at least some mould lines that I'm going to need to clean up. On this kit they're not too bad at all and won't be too difficult to clean up. There's a fair bit of detail in these parts. I'm no VK4502 surgeon, so I couldn't tell you if everything here is super realistic or accurate, and I'm not so sure how far construction of this tank even went in real life. I'm pretty sure they didn't even build a hull, so there might not even be a way to know how realistic this is or isn't. Anyway, all these parts look good to me, and I feel like they should go together relatively easily. Here we can see the individual track links. They do look pretty good, and I certainly hope they won't be a nightmare to put together. I'm sure they'll be fine. And of course, decals are included. These are still in the bag to stop them from being damaged. There's also some photo etch grills. These look really neat. On the other side of that bag are some towing cables. I'm not sure what these are made of. Is it copper? I don't know, but it looks like they'll make some nice realistic towing cables. Also, unsurprisingly, there's an instruction booklet. There's quite a few pages here, and the instruction diagrams themselves are, for the most part, easy to understand and follow. The last page shows a very basic painting guide. I do like that they include a couple of different paint choices, including Mr. Hobby, Vallejo, and Model Master. It is pretty simple, but I'm sure somebody might find it useful. Okay, enough jibber jabber, let's put this thing together. The first step seems to be adding these hull side bits, I guess you might call them. These have holes for the lift rings to be installed later, and they go into place pretty easily. There's a recess on the hull tub that these parts can easily lock into. I then glue the upper and lower halves of the hull together. This is also pretty easy, though I did find I needed to apply a fair bit of pressure, particularly to the join at the front of the hull. The result is fairly decent. Very hully. This kit comes with no internal hull detail, but that's okay. It seems like it would be pretty hard to see into the hull anyway. It's then time to assemble the suspension. I'm not sure what you would call this part, some sort of round bar? It goes together easily due to the guide pins. Those are usually quite helpful. Then comes an end cap which I glue here. This is again made simple by the keying. Next I make wheels. Each wheel is made up of 2 different parts, or well, I guess they're actually just 2 separate wheels, but you glue them together as a set. There are 2 different kinds of wheel assemblies to put together, and we'll put one of each on each bogie. One has a much larger hub that sticks out further than the other, so you should be able to tell them apart quite easily. This is easy to do as long as you are using the correct parts. Next comes this arm thing, whatever it might be called. This consists of 2 parts between which you sandwich the rod-looking thing we just assembled. Do make sure you get all the parts the right way around. There's a little tab thing to help you get the correct positioning of the semicircular part here. I definitely make an effort to not glue the moving bits. I do want the suspension parts to move a bit, at least until I know exactly where I want them. At this point I'm not sure of that. Next come the wheels. These quite easily glue onto the axle bits on the bogie we just assembled. The wheel with the smaller hub goes on the end of the rounded cylindery bit like so. And the larger hub obviously goes on the remaining axle, the one at the end where the two parts of the bogie pivot. These are pretty easy to do. Not all of these assemblies are identical, and the instructions will help you put the right parts together if you are building this kit. As you can see, we end up with a whole bunch of wheels. I'm going to put a few other things on before installing these though. First, these things. I think these might be skids for the tracks to brush up against. I've got no idea what else they might be. They are easy enough to place. There are slots for them at each end of the hull on both sides. Next, another thing I don't have a name for. Some kind of brackety thing. It goes here at the rear of the hull and will sit in the middle of the drive sprocket. Be sure to use the correct parts for either side of the tank. They are different. There's also a similar thing for the front. These parts are identical though, and there's nothing too tricky about getting them into place. With those on, I add the road wheel assemblies. As you can see by the keying, these aren't all going to be the same. The bogies, are these even bogies? They might be. Whatever, they go into place quite easily guided by the keying. There are two with the movable end of the bogie facing towards the rear of the hull, and one the other way around. Don't worry too much, as long as you built the wheel assemblies properly, the keying should see to it that this doesn't go wrong. There is a small amount of movement in the suspension, but only on one wheel of each bogie, which does seem a little bit restrictive if you want to model this tank going over bumps or logs or something. I'm pretty sure both wheels would move up and down on the real thing. Oh well, I'll probably end up gluing them into place with the tank level later on anyway. Then I add the shackles to the front of the hull like so. This is simple enough. They would probably just stay in place with the power of friction, but I want to be sure, so I glue them down. Easy enough. Now it's time for sprockets. I built the rear ones first. There is some keying to ensure the teeth of the sprockets line up, which is going to be important when we want them to engage with the tracks later on. The assembly is the same for the left and right side, except for the innermost non-sprockety bit, which will join to the hull. I've glued this assembly onto the rear of the hull thusly. There's keying to help guide this, and the big gap there will be filled in later. I decided to build the forward sprocket as free moving, with the thought that it would make track installation a bit easier. The way to do this is to glue the central pin part here only into the base part that will join the hull. Onto that I glue the outer part of the sprocket. The keying here helps you position this so that the teeth are nice and aligned. Again, that will be important for engaging the track later on. Those assemblies can then be glued onto the hull. This is pretty easy, just make sure not to be too messy with the glue if you want to have the sprockets movable later on. Next, I attach this lift bracket thing to the rear of the hull. There's a different part for either side, so be sure that you're using the correct parts. These are very easy to install, and there are little guides on the back of these parts that help with this. Then comes what I believe to be the rear convoy light. This is simple enough to put on. And after that, I make the jack. No, not the drink. This is comprised of a few parts. The central two parts have pins to guide the positioning, which makes it very easy to put them together. Then I add the bottom plate part, which goes on the end like so. It takes a little bit of nudging to get the position right, but it's not hard to do. Then I put the handle on. This goes into place easily with just a little bit of nudging to get the positioning just right. The mounting brackets come next. I just clip them in place at first, figuring I can always add glue after I've put the assembly on the hull. It's not too hard to get into place, though mine did end up just a little bit wonky. That's okay though. This part probably got knocked around a fair bit during use anyway. Next, why not add the shackles to the rear of the hull? These pretty much just clip right into place like the shackles on the front did. I use the power of gravity to hold them down at the correct angle while I apply the glue. Simple enough. Then I move back to the front of the hull and install the driver's vision device. This pretty much just drops right into place. I apply a little bit of pressure to make sure there isn't too much of a gap, and it's on. And then, the mounting for the hull machine gun. The instructions seem to want me to install the gun and then the mounting, but I figure it's a better idea to install the mount and then the gun. That way there's less risk of damaging the gun while applying pressure to the mount. The mounting does have a small gap around it, which I'm not sure it should have, but it's not too bad and would be pretty easy to correct if need be. Then, the gun barrel goes into place really easily. It's not as small and fragile as a gun in 15mm scale would be, but it would still be easy enough to break, and we don't want that. Then I join the two halves of the headlamps together. There is keying to help you get the front part on the right way up. Nobody wants wonky slits on their headlamps. This is pretty simple, and so is installing the two headlamps on the front of the hull. They do need a little bit of nudging to get them into place, but it's not especially challenging, though I didn't manage to get mine perfectly in place. But hey, we can always imagine that they tested their strength by bashing them with a crowbar or something. Now, let's add some stuff to the engine deck, like this set of wire cutters. This is pretty simple to attach. Just add some glue and nudge it around until you're satisfied with how it sits. Then, on the other side, we can install the fire extinguisher. Probably quite an important piece of equipment on Porsche's tanks. Then comes this raised box that goes around the grille on the rear of the engine deck. I'm not sure what this is for. Maybe it's to stop water or other debris from falling into the grille. It's pretty easy to install. I just sat it in place and then added glue so that it stays there. I then install the tools on the left side of the hull. There are indents into which these mount, just be sure to use the correct ones. These tools are quite easy to install and look pretty neat. I'm sure some people would prefer to leave things like these off until after painting, but I'm pretty confident I can paint these neatly enough without doing that. I have had plenty of practice on smaller scales after all. Then I figured, why not attach the ends of the towing cables? I start by cutting the cable in half, and then making sure that each part was the same length, though I wasn't 100% sure the length was correct. I then twist the ends of the cable in the same way as the individual wires are already twisted. This should make it neat enough to easily fit into the end parts. I apply some super glue, because plastic cement won't work on metals, and slot the end part onto the cable, obviously at both ends. This is pretty easy, and the super glue should hold it together quite nicely, though if you really want to, you should be able to pull it apart again. I think I will leave these off until painting time. The tools will be fine, but this will probably be a lot easier to paint separately, and I might even decide to leave one or even both of them off. I will, however, install the cable holding brackety things. These are pretty simple to install and they are all the same part, so there's no need to worry about getting the right one on in the right spot, but there certainly is a proper way for them to be mounted. I've done it wrong along the bottom here, but I didn't realise it until later. I then add these handles to the engine deck. This probably could have been done at the same time as the fire extinguisher and wire cutters, but oh well. These are thin pieces and a little bit fiddly, but not too hard to get into place. The tweezers are quite helpful here. Then I add stuff to the right side of the hull. That's mostly this set of rods, which I'm assuming are for the gun cleaning kit. This goes on very easily. You can see I've also installed the brackets for the towing cables. This time, the bottom two are installed correctly with the opening facing upwards, and I did correct them on the tank's left side as well. It's a little bit messy, but it could be a lot worse, and it really shouldn't be all that noticeable once the tank is painted and weathered. I test fitted the cables and realised they were just a bit too short. This is my fault because I trimmed the cables down thinking they might be a bit too long. I considered it for a bit, then decided that I could just move the rearmost cable brackets forward a bit, but I didn't actually film that because I'm a numpty. Moving on, I add more detail to the tank's butt. Butt. This, I guess it's a jacking block, goes into these two holes here at the upper right on the rear plate. Then these semicircular bits cover the openings here on the final drive covers. They go into place pretty easily, and they probably could have been installed earlier, though I don't suppose it really matters. It doesn't affect the installation of any of the other parts. Then comes this, I think it's an antenna mount? Maybe some stretched out sprue or wire or something could be added to this to make it look a bit more antenna-like. After that, I attach these hooks, I guess you might call them. These go onto the rear of the engine deck here, like so. They were a little bit fiddly, but not too hard to get into place. These are for holding the spare track links, which I add next. This is a simple matter of gluing two links together, and then slotting them onto the hook things. I wasn't super happy with these. They seem to sit a bit too high, but I suppose it could be worse, and it will probably look better once everything is painted. That's about all we need to do to the hull. The next thing to do would be adding tracks, but I didn't really feel like dealing with them at the time. We also need to add the photo etch grill details, but I'm going to leave those off until later as well. I want to prime the inside of the vents first, and I would prefer to do so at the same time as I'm priming something else. Makes for less setup and cleaning time. So I started working on the turret instead. The interior of the turret is very detailed. Initially I considered omitting some of the parts that would be less or not at all visible from the outside. But then I decided, hey, I paid for all of these little parts and I might as well use them. I start by installing this interior roof detail panel, or whatever you might call it. This almost certainly won't be visible at all once everything else is together, but it might hold stuff that will be visible, and it is easy to install, so why not? Then I install the inside half of the turret front. This is also easy to get into place. Hopefully I've got it on correctly. Then there's this internal wall part for the rear and sides. I install this in sections to try and get it on as neatly as I can. I think I got it in fairly well. Still, it's always a good idea to test fit things. So I test fit with the bottom of the turret, and it looks like it's going to fit okay. Though I might have to do a little bit of filing in some areas to get a nice flush fit. Then I install this plate on the back wall, obviously on the inside. It probably won't be visible later either, but I put it in anyway. Now to add some details, starting with a pair of cylinder things. The first one mounts here near where the gunner's vision device will go. The other one goes at the back here behind the commander's hatch. I have no idea what either of these are or do, but they're in there now. Then it's time to put together the internal half of the commander's cupola. I add 7 of these vision devices, which more or less just drop right into place, though a little bit of nudging to get them just where you want them will help. Behind each of these I put these handle thingies. It's a bit fiddly to get them all in and lined up nicely, but I got there eventually. Once that assembly is complete, it's time to install it here. There are guide pins, but I'm not 100% sure I got this seated correctly, though it does look fine, and will probably be hard to see later if it is a bit wrong. Oh well, let's move on and add some more cylinder things here, like so, followed by a ventilation thing. I'm not sure if there's a fan in here, or if it's just a grill to cover the ventilation hole. Looks decent enough though. A fire extinguisher goes on the loader's side of the turret, nothing tricky about installing this. Then comes this little plate, which, to be fair, could probably have been omitted without anybody really noticing. It is super easy to place though. I then install the vision device for the gunner, or I assume it's for the gunner anyway. You can see it protrudes up and out of the turret. I then slot this brackety thing in behind and over the vision device. Simple enough. Next, I added the external portion of the commander's cupola. I figured putting this on before applying the small details might make it a little bit easier to do so. I won't have to worry about shifting or breaking the smaller detail parts when applying pressure. It goes on easily enough, guided by guide pins. What a concept. I'm not so sure there should be so much space between this and the inner part. Probably not. It doesn't look like it from the pictures anyway. I can fill that gap with putty later though, so it's not a big issue. I add the covers over the vision devices all the way around the cupola, which is pretty easy to do. Then this thing. I guess you might call it a bracket. It will hold the hinge part of the commander's hatch. Then on top of the vision device covers I mount the MG ring. There's nothing to guide this, so I just eyeball it. I did actually break the MG ring while trying to clean it up, but I glued it back together and it's pretty hard to see where I damaged it. This part is optional, so you don't need to install it, but I think it adds some interest, so I put it on. I won't be mounting an MG to it though. Now it's time to add a little bit of detailing to the loader's hatch, starting with these handles. Tweezers are pretty helpful here. These were a little bit fiddly owing to them being so small. Once those are in place, this locking wheel can go on. This is pretty easy. Give it a bit of a nudge to make sure it's nice and straight, and it's done. Then comes this part, the name of which I can't think of. It's a guide for the hatch, I guess. Whatever it is, it goes on easily enough. A handle can then be installed on the outside of the hatch to make opening it a little bit less of a challenge. This is of course tiny and a little bit fiddly, but not too hard to do. Then I installed a cover for the gunner's vision device. This goes into place as simply and easily as it looks, and it looks decent. I follow that with some lift rings. These are all the same part, so don't worry too much about which one you're putting where. They're pretty small, but not small enough that tweezers are required. My fat fingers got the job done just fine. Now the turret can be lifted off with a crane, though using a giant hand like I am is a bit more practical if you do have that choice. Then this little round plug thing can be put into place on the side of the cupola. This is very easy to install. I'm not really sure what it is, maybe a pistol port for the commander or something like that. Then I assemble this port for the side of the turret. These parts go together very easily, and you could simply glue it into place here, but I want to model it open, which is going to be a bit more tricky. I skipped ahead in the instructions a bit and installed the arm thing this hatch would swing out on. I tried to install this in such a way that it would stick out a bit further than it probably really should. This is to make it a bit easier for it to hold onto the hatch part. I leave those parts for a while so they bond properly, and then glue the loader's hatch into place. This is, as you can see, in the open position. The little arm thing on the hatch seems to be hovering in the middle of nowhere, but I don't see anything I can do about that. I do like to build most of my models buttoned down. If I'm going to build the interior, I want as many hatches open as possible. Then I go back to the side hatch thing and glue it into place. I don't think this kit is really designed to be built this way, so I ended up doing a lot of fiddling and nudging, and the fit is still a bit janky. But in the end I got it done and we can look in through this little hole now. That's what matters to me. I then assemble the commander's hatch. The bar thing that holds onto the hatch goes over the top like so. The little bump you can see should be on the opposite side of the hatch from the bar part. This grab handle goes into the two holes on the top here. I set this aside to bond for a bit while I add the cover for the air vent. This is incredibly easy to install, and now the crew can breathe easy. That is, unless Hans has had beans for breakfast again. Damn it, Hans. Next, I add this little hatch. I'm not sure what it's for, but I decided I wanted it open. Not that you can really see much through it anyway. It's pretty easy to install. Most of the things on this model are. I then tried to install the commander's hatch. The mounting pin for this isn't quite long enough to be modelled in the open position. I decided instead of trying to half-arse it, I would set the part aside for now and come up with a solution later. I wanted to keep building. I attached this rear door thing to the rear of the turret. It doesn't seem to fit very well. There isn't really anything to lock it into that recess, so I had to more or less eyeball it and try to get it into a position where there was minimal gap showing. There is also meant to be an internal part to this, but it felt kind of redundant, so I didn't add it. Saved myself a good few seconds of work there. I eventually got it into a position where I thought it looked okay, so I moved along and started assembling the rear hatch. I glued the two halves of the hatch together, sandwiching this bar between them. I want the bar to move, at least for now, so I make sure to avoid getting any glue on it. Then I glue this little plug into place. Easy enough. Into that I glue this round bit. I'm not sure what either of those are. Surely they've got a purpose though. Into these little holes here I glue handles. There's one of these for either side, and they're quite easy to get into place, even without tweezers. I then add these things, which look like they may be locking handles for the hatch. They look a bit awkward. Maybe they're in the locked position rather than open, which is how I'll be building this hatch. Either way, they're easy enough to install. I then attach this plate. I don't know what this is or what it does, but it goes into place pretty easily. I then glue that entire assembly onto the rear of the turret here like so. This is why I wanted that bar across the bottom of the hatch to be movable, to allow for adjusting the angle that the hatch will be sitting at. I then install the big loopy things that go over the hatch's bar on either side of the turret. Yep, that certainly is the technical term for them. You can see that these don't quite reach the main part of the turret, and I think they should. But I don't think this is really a major issue. At any rate, it's almost certainly user error rather than a problem with the kit. Next, I turn my attention to the interior again, and I install these bits, whatever they are. That's not too difficult at all. Then comes whatever this part that hangs down from the roof is. I imagine it's some kind of sight or control for the commander. After that, I glue in this bar that would secure the little hatch on the roof into place. There's a little butterfly bolt part that holds that in place. I wasn't sure if that should actually be there while the hatch was open, but I put it on anyway for reasons. It's a little fiddly owing to its size, but I got it there eventually. I then glued this little handle onto the end of this thing. It was very easy to get into place, and it looks good, so why not install it now? It was a little bit fiddly to get inside the turret, but not impossible. I think this might be the opening and closing mechanism for the commander's hatch. Seems a bit overly complicated, but that's German tanks, I suppose. I then put this cylinder thing in. Are you sick of me not knowing what all of the parts are yet? Too bad. Now it's time for some ammo racks. Heh, rack. These are pretty easy, at least as long as you are using the correct parts and putting them in the correct locations. There's a bunch of different rack pieces here, so pay attention to the instructions. That should help you put them in the right place. Test fitting is also a good idea. It's not too hard to get them all in nice and neat. Then we can add the shells. This is pretty easy. You can of course put as many shells in as will fit, or you could put none, or anywhere in between. I've decided to have a mostly full load. Load. This does take a little bit of nudging, but they go in pretty easily. It makes sense to then install those racks into the turret. They went into place pretty easily. The arm parts on the tops of the racks should connect up with the little rectangle on the roof. There's no keying, but it's pretty simple to eyeball it, and it ended up looking pretty good if you ask me. Now let's move deeper down into the turret and build this. I guess this is the motor for the turret rotation, and it comes as two parts. These go together very easily, guided by the little pins and corresponding holes. I then add this end part of the motor, easy enough. Next comes this thing, which seems to have some springs on it. It's not really clear what angle this should be at, but I think I got it right. I then install this ring or collar part that goes around this part of the motor like so. This clearly comes as two parts, and it did require a little bit of nudging, for which I had to use my knife to actually get in there. Eventually it does go together somewhat neatly. Then I install this tiny lever, and then another one at the top of that bar with the springy looking bits. These are obviously small and fiddly, but not the most difficult thing ever. Also, apologies for the blurry video here. That's going to happen a bit more as this goes on, because a lot of these parts were very tiny and hard to get a focus on. After the parts had bonded for a little while, I install that motor onto this base plate. This is pretty easy. Then I put together this strange cone-shaped piece of equipment. It also goes together pretty easily. Then this end part goes onto the wider end of the cone. It's keyed so it only goes into place one way. Whatever this thing is, it goes onto the side. This seems like it connects this assembly to the motor I built earlier. Onto the top of the core I glue this plate with a pin and mounting hole, and then onto that I install some gears. This is a little bit fiddly, but pretty straightforward. Just be careful and take your time to get everything on neatly. Next comes this little cover thing at the top. I guess this is to stop curious tankers from sticking their fingers into the gears to see what happens. Then it's time to attach the left side of the frame part to the floor part. This is pretty simple. There's some tabs and corresponding holes to make sure these parts go together properly, though you do have to make sure the vertical alignment is correct yourself. I leave the frame to bond for a while so that it stays together when I try to attach the gear assembly. Then I attach this little plate thing. I put the geary assembly thing into place, and then I quickly added the left side of the frame. This did take a little bit of fiddling to get on satisfactorily, and it is admittedly still a bit messy, but that's okay. It's not going to be super visible anyway. That small plate that I added earlier refused to fit properly, so I took it out. You'd probably never know anyway. The next thing I did was to glue the assembly I just put together onto the base of the turret basket like so. Nothing too much to this. I then installed this hatch. It didn't fit all that well, but it's in place well enough for me. Again, it's probably not going to be super visible. Next, this little bar thing goes into place. Not sure what it is or what it does, but I think I put it more or less in the right place. The next section of the instructions was a tiny bit confusing. It's really just a whole bunch of little assemblies, so let's get to building those. I start by gluing this cable into this box. I figured this was simple enough to install on the main part, so I did that. It was a bit fiddly, but I got it on eventually, and it looks neat enough. Then I build another assembly. It kind of felt like I was just gluing random bits together, but they do all have a purpose, even if I don't really know what that purpose is. These parts are all small and fiddly, but they go together easily enough if you're patient and take your time. Sometimes I'm patient. Sometimes. I make another assembly that's based around this little wheelie thing. It is of course wheelie fiddly, but I do eventually get it together in a way that I think is correct. We'll find out later if it actually is correct. Next, I glue the two halves of this cylinder thing together. That's easy enough to do, and I leave it to bond for a bit. Then I take the assembly I put together before, and I add this thing with a couple of protrusions. This goes on easily. I then install that assembly here on the turret basket. It takes a bit of nudging to get this right. That bar there should link into the round part on the turret rotation mechanism. It's a bit messy, but it's more or less in the right place, and that's what matters. I then install that wheelie assembly. The fit is a bit rough, and it looks kind of messy, at least to me. Surely this thing could have just been a single part. Good thing that assembly is then covered with this plate thing. It still looks a bit messy, but the plate does hide quite a lot of that. Next, I install this control wheel on the end of this arm. This is simple. I think I've got it on at the right angle anyway. Then comes the cylinder thing I glued together earlier. It goes on the right side of the turret gear assembly like so. Like a lot of the other parts, this is a bit fiddly, but not too hard to get into place. There's a bit of a gap on the side of this, but I think I'll just ignore that. Next, I join these two parts together, which is pretty easy. There is keying to help with it. I then glue this frame thing on the end of the bar, and then a control wheel in front of that. It takes a little nudging to get it to sit nice and straight, but I did get it there eventually. I set that aside to bond, and then I glue these three parts together, which is pretty simple, though I did need to apply a fair bit of pressure. I then add this arm. I leave it to set for a bit so it doesn't just fall apart when I try to put it onto the rest of the turret basket, though through the magic of editing, you don't have to watch the drying process and I can install it seemingly right away. Magic. There's a couple of tabs to guide the positioning of this and it's pretty easy to get into place. Then I glue this seat onto the end of the arm part. This doesn't look like the most comfortable seat, but it does go on pretty easily, and I certainly appreciate that. I then install the other control wheel assembly I built earlier. I found it a little bit fiddly to get into place, but I think I got it more or less correct. Next, I glue together these two bars. It was a bit difficult to see how these should go together at first, but I did get there, I think. Then this control wheel goes here. That assembly can then be glued into place here. There's a guide tab to make sure it sits properly. That's pretty easy and looks quite good. I'm not sure what this control is for, but I would assume gun elevation so the loader can elevate and depress the gun. Maybe to help load it or something. I don't know, I'm not a turret surgeon. I'm just making guesses. Then comes this plate thing that goes on the front of the frame. It does need a little bit of pressure applied to make sure the gap isn't too bad. But hey, applying pressure is what we do, so it's not too hard. I then install the gunner's seat. It doesn't look all that comfortable, but then I guess this is a tank. Crew comfort probably wasn't that high on the list. The seat does get a backrest though, which consists of 3 tiny parts. They were a little bit fiddly to get together, and I did consider omitting it, but I didn't give up, and I got there. I let it sit for a while before installing it. Nothing is worse than trying to put a part into place and having it shift because it's not bonded properly. Well, there are worse things, but you know what I mean. While it bonds, I glue together the two halves of this thing. I think this might be for catching the spent shells from the coaxial machine gun. There are guide pins that make this pretty easy to put together. Then I install the gunner's backrest assembly. This took a fair bit of nudging until I was satisfied with it. It's probably not quite perfect, but it looks near enough for me. If the gunner has any complaints, I'm just going to ignore him. Then that cylinder and tube part can be installed. It glues into place on the floor at the front right like so. Pretty simple. That said, this is looking pretty complicated already. I'm glad I won't be doing a very detailed paint job inside the turret. Next, I attach this plate thing to the rear of the turret floor. This thing is part of what will suspend the turret basket from the turret ring. To get it to hang from the turret ring, I attach these little things. These are small and fiddly, and I found it hard to tell if I was putting them on right, but it does seem like I've put them on at least near enough to correctly anyway. That looks like all I need to do with the turret basket parts, and I can now install it into the turret bottom. But before that, I add a couple of other bits to the turret bottom part. First, this plate. I don't know what this is for, but it goes into place easily. I'm installing it now because I figured it would be a bit tricky to install with the turret basket in place. Then I add the rear part of the lower ammo rack. Some of the rack does come moulded on the turret bottom part, and it looks like the forward part of the rack shouldn't go into place until after the basket is installed, so I figured I might as well do that now. It more or less just drops right into place, though the fit isn't quite perfect. It is good enough though. There are still a few more internal details to add. I assembled this seat, which I'm pretty sure is for the commander. This goes together pretty easily. It's just a matter of gluing the seat part onto the tab on the end of the support bar. While I let that bond, I installed this thing, which I'm thinking might actually be a footrest for the commander or something like that. I also glued the forward part of the ammo rack in. They more or less just drop right into place. I forgot to record it though because I'm a dunce. I then install these gauges in the front left part of the turret ring. I had to nudge them with my knife to get them to sit properly, but that's not very hard to do. Next comes this switchy handly thing here. I'm not sure what it is. Maybe it's some kind of isolation switch for the loader, so he can disable the gun and not be crushed by recoil or something like that. Again, just guessing. And then, because it's been sitting there for a while, I install the commander's seat. This is pretty simple to get into place. I don't remember if you can model the seat flipped up out of the way, but I'm pretty sure the seat could do that on the real thing. I then install this shieldy thing, I guess you might call it. Well, maybe not you, but that's what I'm going to call it. There is one of these for either side of the turret, and with a bit of pressure, they're easy enough to install. The parts for either side are different enough that you shouldn't get them confused and try to put them on the wrong side, I hope. The fit on these is not the best, and they do kind of want to flex out of place, but if you hold them in place while the glue bonds, they should be fine. Whatever this thing is, it goes into place next. Not really much to say about it. It fits pretty well. Then comes this thing, which I'm pretty sure is a funnel to catch the spent brass from the coaxial machine gun. It very nearly dropped right into place, but it turns out I had to do a bit of nudging to get it right where I wanted it. Then I apply glue to make sure that it stays there. It looks pretty neat. I then install the commander's backrest. You've got to have something to lean on when you're the commander. It was easy enough to place, though it did take a little bit of fiddling to find the right spot for it. It does seem to be sitting a little bit high, but I couldn't get the part to go any lower. I'm sure it's fine, especially since it won't be the easiest thing to see once the turret is all together. Ammunition can be installed next. These are pretty easy to place. I'm not quite sure if I've got them in at the right angle. They are shown to be in a kind of V shape, which I assume is to allow the crew to climb up and over them to get to the rear hatch. My main concern is that they may be too close to the sides of the turret and interfere with the upper turret part being installed. Time for another subassembly. The first two parts of this go together very easily, almost nothing to it, but this smaller part here is a bit more fiddly, considerably more fiddly. Because my fingers, and probably yours too, are too big to get in there, I had to use my knife to manipulate the part. Fiddly, but certainly doable. This flat part should go here, but it doesn't really seem to fit. I cut the part down so that it would fit. This will probably ruin some rivet counter's day, but the part fits now while still protruding the right amount, so I glue it into place. Moving on, I glue the two halves of the interior part of the main gun together. There's a bunch of guide pins that make this easy to put together nice and neatly. There is a slight gap in this, but it won't be very visible anyway, so I don't worry about it. Next I glue this little plate thing on, and then I glue the end of the breech into place. This is sort of keyed to fit properly, and it's pretty easy to get into place. I apply pressure to make sure the parts bond good and proper. Then I attach these platey, brackety things. These fit around the gun barrel in these slots. It's a simple enough fit, though you might need to apply some pressure. Do make sure the little cutaway bits are at the top of the gun, as I've done here. There's another similar plate-like part that goes on a little further up the barrel, though there's only one piece to put on there. It mounts nice and easily up against the triangular piece of bracing on the top of the barrel. I then glue together the two halves of the breech thing. The breech block, I think it's called? The bit that slides up behind the shell and stops it from flying out the back of the gun barrel when it fires. That thing. I don't want to install it just now, because the rest of the breech may not be totally bonded yet. In the meantime, I attach these two plate things with holes in them on either side of the barrel between the two platey things I installed over the barrel earlier. You know, right where you can see me gluing them in. These did need a little bit of nudging, but were otherwise pretty simple to install. Then I install that assembly I made before. It's got both the pivot point for the main gun and the mounting for the coaxial machine gun on it, and it goes into place pretty simply. Just apply a bit of pressure and it's on. And then I add the part for the other side. This is a single part, and it fits just as easily. There is keying for both of these parts, which is good. This is something that should certainly be attached with at least some precision, otherwise the gun would be mounted all wibbly wobbly like, and we don't want that. I then install the breech thing. Is it called the breech block? Maybe, I'm no tankologist so I don't know. This is a bit of a tight fit, but it's not too bad and it does still move, so you could model it up or down. I chose up, and I glued it into place so I can't go back on that choice. Then I glue this little cylinder thing into place here. Simple enough. And then I glue this lever thing into the side of the plate. Nothing too tricky about this. It can then be glued into the side of the breech with the lever thing in the upper forward corner. There's another plate that can be glued on the other side of the breech. There is a little bit of a gap around these parts, but I'm not especially worried about it. Next, I assemble a pair of cylinders. These are both quite simple to put together, though they aren't identical. The instructions will tell you which parts should go together. I think these might be the recuperators for the gun. I install them on these curved cutouts in the plates on the gun barrel. Pretty simple really, though I wasn't entirely sure of the positioning of the cylinder on the gun's right, and because the glue hadn't set yet I was able to move it a bit forward, which is where I think it should sit. This might be entirely wrong, but I don't really care at this point. You will definitely struggle to see these parts when the turret is together. Next comes this lever. I wasn't really sure of the angle this should be pointed down at, and you can see that I've adjusted it between shots. Then another side plate thing goes on. This goes into place pretty easily. Seems to be in the right position at least. And after that I install this triangular bracket thing. I'm sure this joins up with something, but at this point I have no idea what that might be. Then I install this little brackety thing for the coaxial machine gun. It was a little fiddly, but it did eventually go into what looks like the right position. Moving around to the other side of the gun, I attach this breech guard part. It seems to fit well enough. I then add the bottom framey part. This was a little bit more fiddly. I'm not entirely sure I got the parts on quite perfectly, but they are on, and that's what matters, at least to me. This kind of flippant attitude probably makes the blood boil for rivet counters. Good. Next, I turn my attentions to the machine gun. There are a few bits to add to this, so it can be installed in the coaxial position, and I did find them to be quite fiddly, and I kind of put them on a bit messily. I figured this would be okay because it's not really going to be seen anyway. At least I didn't just omit them. Onto this brackety bit, I attach this thing, which seems to be a funnel to collect the spent brass casings from the machine gun. Before that part can fall out of place, I add the brackety bit on the other end and manipulate it into place with my knife. It's definitely a bit messy, but it'll do. I leave it to set, and then I install the right gun trunnion. I try to get this on as neat and straight as I can. I do want the main gun to fit nicely after all. I did this now so the part would have time to fully bond before I tried to install the other trunnion and the gun assembly itself. Then I install this thing that goes above where the coaxial machine gun will go. I don't know what it is, but it looks kind of like a little sunshade or something. Not that there'll be any sun where this is going to be mounted. I then put the MG in. I think this is an MG34. This kind of just slides into place, and I was expecting it to be much more fiddly than it was. I glue it in and hope that's the right place. I did later test fit the turret, and was satisfied with how much of the gun was visible through its port, so hooray for that. Next I install this thing, Again, I'm not sure what it is, but it looks like a lever. Whatever it is, the instructions want me to put it here, so I do. Then I make a gun sight. Because I'm a doofus, I'm doing whatever it is I did out of frame. I'm sure you could figure out how the parts go together if you were building this yourself. You don't really need me to show you. I believe in you. The completed part simply slots into place here on the left side of the gun, where the gunner happens to sit. What a coincidence. I then install the gun assembly. I try to make sure everything is lined up nice and straight. The pivot points here aren't rounded, rather they're angular, so the gun locks into whatever elevation you set it at and it shouldn't move up or down. I do still glue it into place to make sure it stays there, but it's nice to have options. And with that, the internal parts of the turret are completed. It certainly did take a lot of work, but it does look pretty interesting. I'm going to leave the upper and lower turret halves unglued until at least the inside is painted, so I move on to some more external details. As you can probably see here, I've primed the interior parts of the vents on the hull. This should prevent bits of tan-coloured plastic being visible through the vents and looking weird, and it's much easier than trying to get good coverage in there by trying to spray paint through the photo etch grills, which I'm going to install now. This is pretty easy. They're neat, straight-edged parts that are easily lined up and placed where they should go. Obviously, superglue needs to be used for these because plastic cement doesn't like bonding with metals. I think it's just lazy. Because I am often asked, I like using the cheap superglue from the supermarket rather than hobby-specific glues. It's just a bit cheaper. I also like the kind that comes with a brush. I then install my solution for the ill-fitting commander's hatch. I've just taken a piece of sprue and drilled a hole in one end. I glue it into place where the commander's hatch would pivot, and then I glue the hatch into place. Sure, it's not perfect, and this is probably heart attack inducing to rivet counters, but it works and looks fine to me, and it is my model. The important thing is the hatch is open, and I can look in there. Then I move on to the gun. I start that by joining the two halves of the mantlet together. This is pretty easy, and there are a couple of guide pins to help, though there is a bit of a gap down the middle of the mantlet. That can be fixed later. I then put this round ring bit on the end of the mantlet. It fits nice enough. I apply pressure, though I think those gaps are meant to be there. Next, I join the two halves of the gun barrel together. This is simple enough, and the result is okay, though it could definitely do with a bit of sanding and filling. I'll do that later, because now I'm going to put the muzzle brake together. First, there's a little baffle thing that should go in here like so. Then I glue the other half of the muzzle brake on. This is pretty easy, though it's not perfect. It will get some attention from the sanding sticks and putty later on. Then the muzzle brake can be attached to the front of the barrel. There's keying here which lines up the slight gaps on both parts, and will lock into the base of the gun to ensure the muzzle brake is positioned correctly. I test fit the gun in the internal breech part and it seems to fit properly. I won't be gluing it on until the turret is put together though. Gluing the gun together now would make it impossible, or at the very least incredibly difficult, to put the turret top on, and I don't see the point in making things harder for myself. Moving on, it's time to assemble the tracks. This was very time consuming. I removed the mold lines, and separated them into stacks of the two different kinds of links. Then I put on some good videos. For you I might suggest some of my own videos. Is that too much? And sat there joining link after link after link after link after link together. It's not hard, just a bit time consuming. Obviously you do need to alternate between the link with the guide horn and the one without. Once I've got a good length of track glued together, I attach it as the bottom run. Most of the links should be fairly well bonded at this point, so it should be pretty easy to get them to stay flat. Once I've got the tracks sitting how I want them, I apply glue so they don't fall off. That would be quite annoying. At one end, I attached individual links to go around the curved parts of the sprocket, and I made a longer but not too long section of track for the front. You can do it either way really. I installed the rest in small segments to ensure that the links were glued together but still had a little bit of flex to them. Attaching these tracks wasn't all that bad really. There were a few frustrating moments for sure, but nothing too bad. The main thing is that it just takes a lot of time to do. Still, I would rather spend that time than suffer the rubber band style tracks. I think they look pretty good. Nice metal tracks might look even better, but these come with the kit, so they cost much less. And so that's the VK4502P Vorne in 1/35th scale by Hobby Boss completed. And I'm pretty happy with the result. This is one of the tanks I learned about from World of Tanks, and since then I've always found it pretty interesting. I mean, I don't know much or really care about its stats, and it was never produced, but it's still pretty interesting to look at, and for me that is one of the more important things. As you can see, I've already begun painting this. In this video, you can see some overspray from the grey primer I've used on the interior. If you saw the prototypes group build video, you'll have seen it in a grey base coat with at least one highlight. If you want to see that, go and watch that video. I've not got much further than that at this point, but it is slowly coming along and you'll see a painting video for this tank before the end of the year. I won't give a more specific timeline than that, because if I do, I know something's just going to come up and cause delay. Anyway, the detailing on this model is pretty decent. There's not really a lot of stuff on the outside, it's a pretty simple tank externally, and that's not a bad thing, but there is a lot of detail on the inside of the turret, and it did take a ton of time to put there, but I'm glad I added it. It would have been very easy just to model all of the hatches closed and fill my bits box with VK4502 innards. With all of that detail for the turret, I do kind of wish there was some for the hull, but I can see why they might not do that. You can't really see in there anyway, and the hull doesn't really have any hatches to model open, unless you count the engine deck. It would have been nice if they included an engine, and an engine bay, obviously. I'm sure rivet counters don't approve of the detail of this model, but for a tank that wasn't even built, I think it's perfectly fine, and it's definitely going to look good when I finish painting it up, so I'm pretty happy with it. The build, for the most part, was pretty easy, and there was only a couple of bits that were really tricky, like the difficulty in modelling the commander's hatch open. To be honest, for me, the hardest thing was how much time it took. That's the main reason I don't build larger scale kits like this more often. It will probably never be a weekly thing. At this point I've spent about 50 hours on this video, and I still have to do the final edit. Would now be a good time to mention Patreon. For as little as $1 per month, you can help a Herbert Erpaderp have some kind of financial compensation for the hours worked on videos like this one. And there are some rewards for doing so. For example, I've recently started sharing my larger scale builds as a blog on Patreon, with pictures and text as I work my way through the build. At the time of recording, I'm building the AFV Club Centurion Mark 5-1. It's only available to patrons, so if that interests you, head on over to Patreon. If not, that's cool too. So what do you think of this model? Have you built it yourself? Are you a rivet counter whose spleen has burst because of this video? What are you doing here? Go to hospital. Do you think it's an interesting looking tank like I do? Let me know in the comments section below, along with any other questions or comments you might have. Also, don't forget to subscribe, follow, ring the bell, and all the other things you do on YouTube and social media things. Links to all the things, including Patreon and my merch store, are in the description below. As always, I shall return soon, so until then, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.